Hi there, this is Philip from Beyond the Tabletop, and in this video I'm assembling Forgeworld Marauder Imperial Bomber. If you haven't, you can check out the unboxing video that I've already done. That'll be linked in the top right hand corner now. As you can see here, I've got all the parts laid out. I'm going to try and do a very condensed video assembling this kit together. It looks like it'll be a lot easier to do than the Gorgon. Now some parts I will do a sub-assembly, especially when it comes to the cockpits and the gunners, because those figures I want to paint up separately. But for now, let's get on with the build. Now, if you're going to be following along and building yours, you'll need to make sure that you've prepped all the resin first of all. So to do that, you need to give it a wash in warm soapy water, just to help remove any of the releasing agent. You can see a more in-depth guide on this in the top right hand corner now. After that, you can remove all the casting gates and clean up any details such as mould slips or filling in air bubbles. Once you've completed those things, you should be at the same stage I'm at. Firstly, let's look at the instructions, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to put this little video together, because the instructions aren't very clear on the best way to assemble this. You've got, for example, the cockpit here, you've got the front part, you've got the underside, you've got part of the top, and then on the reverse we've got a bit more of a long view, again showing the parts of the underside, the rear and the top. Now there's no correct guide for building. It's certainly not a step-by-step process like the Gorgon instructions were, so I thought I would have a stab at presenting what I think would be the best way to assemble this kit. Now by all means this won't be a definitive version. If you've assembled one already and you think I've done it wrong somehow, please let me know in the comments. It would be really good to get the feedback. So with that all said, let's now give it a go. Now the first step that I want to copy is this section here, which is to do with the pilot and the navigator. So here are the instructions for this section. One difficult thing to note is you'll notice that arrows are actually all over the place. So the arrow heads are just along the model, so just all around here, and the actual labels are down here next to where the arrowhead direction is. So for example, the ladder here refers to this section, the navigator and the navigator seat actually refer to this guy here. So he's in two separate parts, and then the pilot is here, and then the cockpit is the whole model. So if I take that away and show you what we have, we've got the navigator here, who is a piece all on his own, along with his seat. And then we've got the pilot, and then we've got this cockpit piece all to itself. Now the first thing I'm going to do is assemble the ladder to the cockpit. So this goes here. You just need to make sure that the ladder is the right way up. And the easy way to do that is to note that the notch is at the bottom and the flat piece is at the top. So that will glue on like so, forming an extra step. Then I'm going to just assemble the navigator to the seat. So I'm just going to go and glue those in now. So a top tip when it comes to gluing resin together is just to lightly score all the contact points. For this I'm going to use the reverse of the blade, and I'm just going to lightly scratch it up and do a little cross stitch. So if we just look up close, you can see it's been lightly scored. I'll also do that on the cockpit where this is going to join. Then I'm just going to use some super glue. In America you guys call it CA glue. This brand I use is Gorilla, which is really good. You can of course use Games Workshop super glue, it's a pretty good brand. However, I prefer the Gorilla one just because it's slightly more gel-like and a little bit thicker. So it's really good for these large resin pieces. Now with those pieces assembled, you can see that the navigator is attached to his seat and that the ladder is on the cockpit. Now it should be quite straightforward to add these guys in. So there is the pilot, and then we can drop in the navigator, and just with a little bit of pressure those two seats will line up. So here is how it looks with those two just dry fitted in place. Now at this stage you could just glue them in, however I'm going to leave them separate so I can paint them up on their own, as well as get into that cockpit detail without having to worry about the pilots being in the way. So for now let's just leave those two guys on their own, and then we've got this complete part here and we can get on with building the rest of the plane. So the next step is to build the superstructure of the plane, which is the fuselage. Now this is broken down into several parts. You've got the front of the fuselage, you've got the fuselage top and the fuselage bottom. This is one of the biggest pieces. It's the bottom of the fuselage, and this is the underside view. These three sections here are for your landing gear and for your skids, and this large section in the middle is for the bomber door. On the other side you can see that there's some tiny detail here because this is where there are two doors, so you'll see some interior detail here as we build this. Then we've got the fuselage top, which is for the rear portion, and here you can see the top gunner position. These two sections slide in together. The end bit you just want lined up like that. And then the front of the fuselage is this piece here. This circular bit mounts onto there. The cockpit actually needs assembling first. When it comes to assembling this front fuselage, we need to add in our cockpit from below, which slides in place, and this section locks into the front so that Aquila is pointing forwards. So I've done a dry fit, and I've worked out that once this is glued in place you won't actually be able to fit in the navigator and pilot because the seats are quite tight and you can't get the legs past all of these controls. So what I've worked out is that you can drop in the navigator, he's not a problem. What you need to do with your knife is just to take off that square edge just ever so slightly, and that will help mount the seat in. So from this side we can drop in our navigator. You can just go in here, and if I just drop in the pilot, you can see that taking out that edge just helps get that seat in, and then we can just, with a bit of force, drop it down. So those two seats will now be reasonably locked in place. So I should now be fine to glue this cockpit into the top fuselage. This is now all glued in place. What I had to do when gluing it is there was a bit of a gap just between here and here. So I just used my heat gun to heat up these edges, and I could just then bend them into the frame just so there's a better contact point, and had to use a fair amount of glue as well. But with that all now done, we can just take the canopy frame and we can drop that in just to see how it will fit. And the frame looks like it fits in pretty well. Now it could be if this frame is slightly distorted, I can just heat it up ever so slightly just to help bend that frame into place so it sits really flush with the fuselage. One thing to note on this piece is there's quite a few cylindrical casting gates going all the way along here, and I wasn't sure if that was part of a detail I need to keep in, but actually all of that just needed removing so that this could fit in along this edge here, otherwise it just wouldn't fit in. So that's something to bear in mind with that piece. As I mentioned in the unboxing video, you don't get any resin windows, instead you get a small perspex sheet which you can then add in. So I think it's best that I paint this piece up separately, and then I can add in the windows at the very end before gluing this piece into place. So for now we can put this to one side because we won't need it for a while. Then if I bring in the other two pieces of the fuselage, we can see how this all fits in place. So this needs to go to the very back and is flush with that edge, and then this will be able to fit in at the front. And then here we have our main fuselage all complete. One thing to bear in mind that there's a tail piece and a nose piece to add in, so it might be worth having those handy when you're doing this construction section because you want these pieces to be flush. So we have the nose piece here. The thing to note is the Aquila goes at the top and this lip goes at the bottom. So this will slot in place just here. And then the one on the rear will go on like this and just clips into that hole. And now it's almost too big to fit into the frame. That would be our completed piece. So it's worth having those end pieces just to help you line up the fuselage as you're gluing it in place. An interesting thing to note on the front of the nose is that you've got a small little hatch just at the back. So if this plugs into place, in terms of looking through these door hatches, you can see that hatch at the front, and you've got the floor, and then if you look from this side you can just make out that ladder, but there's no other interior detail. So if you did want to turn this into a diorama with this hatch open, you might want to add in some extra detail just here and get all of that painted up before assembling. Now these are quite large pieces, so make sure you've got everything lined up. Potentially only do one piece at a time. So for example, I'm going to start by gluing these two pieces together and then adding this one in, but I'm going to have this piece dry fitted in place so I know that everything is going to align correctly. Likewise, I'm going to have this piece in here so I know that these two pieces are lined up correctly and this is all lined up correctly using the tail end as well. So I've left it for about 10 minutes just to make sure it's all dry. I did use some elastic bands just along here to try and keep this fuselage squashed down just while the glue was setting. and I did have to use a lot of glue, but other than that it was a relatively straightforward job. Now the next step is probably to add in the nose and the tail pieces which we looked at earlier. So this one will go in here. Now, because I'm going to do some conversion work on this bomber, I'm not actually going to glue this piece in just yet, because I'm going to do a fair bit of work just around where these doors are, swapping out the doors for something else, which you'll probably hear more about as the video goes along. Now, I'm not going to glue this one in now, but feel free to do it on yours. I'm going to add on the end piece, which is called the rear turret housing, so that's just going to glue in place there. Now with that turret housing all glued in place, I was next going to start on the tail fin. However, I was thinking that when it comes to doing the wings, I might have to have this model resting upside down for a period of time, just while the wings are gluing in place. And obviously that bit is quite fragile, so I don't want that to come off. So I think I'll save that step for later on. So let's have a look at the wings. So to look at the wings, the best thing to do is look at this underside piece. You can see that you need your 4 engines. You'll also need the engine extension, which are 2 large circular pieces, which are the bits that I was unsure about in the unboxing, as well as your 2 wing pieces. Now the wings attach to the top, but also predominantly via the engines, so you need to assemble the engines to the wing first, and then we can assemble that whole piece to the bomber itself. When it comes to assembling the engines, it's relatively straightforward. You've got 4 identical pieces with a flat underside which will clip onto the wing. You've also got the exhaust, which also has a slight flat side, which will attach to the engine just like this. For the 2 central engines that are closest to the fuselage, you've also got these 2 engine extenders. These go on like so. Again, you've still got your flat side, and then the exhaust attaches on. So the inner 2 engines will be much longer than the outer 2 engines, so they are relatively easy to glue together. However, in terms of sub-assembly for painting, these exhausts are going to be painted a much different colour from the rest of the engine, so I'm actually going to keep these off because it will be much easier to paint these 4 separately together, all one colour, while the engines are going to get painted in the same colour scheme as the rest of the bomber. These are going to be painted up in a metallic colour, so I'm going to leave these off for now. It just makes things easier because I don't have to worry about masking these out, and I can just glue them on at the very end once they're all painted. These 2 extenders, however, are going to get glued on, but before I do that, let's just look at how the engines mount to the wings. So I've got one of the wings here. If we just look at the underside, you can see that this part is plain of detail, and that these 2 bits mark where the engines go. So you can see that these engines effectively just clip in, and then this one will clip in here, and that they will be joined together. That extender piece will go here, and the exhaust will go on here. So I've just loosely placed everything together so you can see what it looks like, and you can see why you need that extender, just to line everything up. And with that done, you can see that you've now got a lip here and this edge here to mount the wing onto the plane. If I bring in the fuselage and I flip this the right way around, you can see that it's going to mount onto this edge just here. So there's not a whole lot of resin to mount those 2 bits together. And then looking at it upside down, you can see that that's going to line up roughly like so. So I've gone away and I've glued those extenders onto the engines, and then I had a good long think about how I want to secure the wings to the fuselage, and I decided I would actually pin it all together. So to do that, I drilled 2 small holes using a 1.5mm drill. So what I did is I measured 2 centimeters across and 5mm down, and then from this side I just did 5mm from this detail block here, and then again 5mm down. So I drilled those 2 holes out using a pin vise. Now a pin vise is one of these, and it actually took a really long time to do. So if you do have an electric drill or some kind of Dremel, I highly suggest doing that, because otherwise you'll spend a good few hours at this. So with that wing in place and that engine sort of locked in as to where it would be, I could use my pin vise and just start drilling down through those 2 holes to make indentations into the fuselage. I could then take this engine block away, and then from these 2 holes I could start drilling these out, With these two holes drilled out, I can then do the exact same thing, but this time on the other engine block. So if we just slide these in place so they'd be locked into the wing as they were, I could then drill into these two holes to make marks into this engine. And with this one, you don't want to drill all the way through, unlike this one. You want to go about halfway through, so about to here, and then that gives you those two holes. Now, as you can see, these holes are much larger than 1.5mm. That's because a 1.5mm rod, while it will sort of do the job, won't be as secure in place as something larger. So instead what I did is I swapped out my 1.5mm drill for a 4mm drill, and then I just expanded it out on all of those pilot holes. So I've then got this 4mm brass rod. It's about 7cm in length. You can actually see it's ever so slightly hollow, so it's actually a tube, but this is just some scrap metal that I had lying around that I didn't need, so I decided to use it for this project. So with all those holes drilled out, if we look on the underside, you can see I've got one in place already. This isn't glued in and it is still really secure, so you can see how far deep in I go all the way. Originally I had the intention of one long piece going all the way along across all the wings for some extra support, but that isn't really practical because it's just impossible for me to drill something quite so long, but also to make it perfectly square with both sets of engines. So if I take this rod, I can just slot them in, and then I can slot this one in. So you can see that's going to be a really good support for the engines. So then I want to take the extended engine block and just mount this on. With that first engine slotted in, you can see there's just a couple of centimeters extending, which will allow me to add in this last engine. With that in place, you can see it's going to be really secure. Once the rods and the engines are all glued in, and then this is glued on top, that's going to be super secure, and there's no way that those wings are ever going to snap off. And as you can see here, that's what it will look like with the other wing added in. And then just on the reverse, you can see those little rods poking through that bomber hatch. So the next step is once again to score all of this resin where there's going to be those contact points. You can see that I've already done it here on this one and on this one here. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is this extender on the right actually was much higher up and wasn't flush with the engine, so I had to spend quite a while using my mold line remover tool just to scrape away at that resin, just so it was all flush. Because when I added in the wing, I noticed there'd be a big gap between it, and that's not what I want. So I had to just carefully sand that one down and make sure I did that on the same thruster. So I've marked an X on this part to correspond with the thruster that I've also sanded down to match. So I'm now just going to go away and glue all of these corresponding parts in. With those glued in place, the wings could then just be glued on top. And that was actually a pretty straightforward process. When it comes to gluing such large surfaces, I found using the Gorilla Gel glue much more effective because there's also a lot more of it as well. So that's just something to bear in mind. With that complete, I think the next step is to look at the tail and completing that. So let's just have a quick look at the instructions. We've got the tail spine, which is a very small part, the tail fin, as well as the tail plane, which is the very top bit. And with this bit, it's quite easy to get mixed up because you would assume that the angle of that arrow would point forwards, but actually it's not. It's the flat bit pointing forwards and that arrow section pointing backwards. I've got the three pieces here that I need. This piece will need to go on first, and as you can see, it will have a slight overhang at the back. Then the spine, it needs to be added in, which will go here. And then lastly, this piece, which making sure it goes this way round, will glue in there. If we just look on the underside, you can see that that slots in quite nicely, so that should be really easy to do. And similar to the wings, these are quite large areas with very small contact points, so with a bit of pressure these could snap off here, and this could potentially come off at the top. So it might be worth pinning these two parts together as well as the tail fin to the fuselage. So I'm probably going to do that with some 1mm rod, but I'll do that all off camera. I've completed the tail parts, they're now all glued down. I used two small pins to connect the fin to the fuselage and also for the plane to the fin. Now the pin isn't very deep when it comes to that plane because you've only got a few millimeters to play with, but I think that's just going to help secure it in case this piece here ever gets knocked. And then the fin spine just got glued down in place. With the tail in place, we've still got a lot of smaller detail to add, which we will continue on with in the next video. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it with your friends. To keep notified of future tutorial videos, make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications. And lastly, if you'd like to support this channel, then head over to Patreon, where you can help this channel grow for as little as $2 a month. Until the next time, take care.